from St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Later in the hour, we'll talk with Brenden Moore of Capital News Illinois about how the crowded Democratic contest to succeed U.S. Senator Dick Durbin is stacking up. We'll also discuss the future of Missouri's 1st Congressional District with State Representative LaKeySha Bosley, and why the St. Louis Democrat believes there will be a major fight in the Missouri legislature if the U.S. Supreme Court guts part of the Voting Rights Act. But first, this was a big week in the world of Missouri redistricting. For a brief refresher, Missouri Republicans created a new congressional map in September, and it's been in a state of legal and political purgatory ever since. This past week saw some big court decisions. Cole County Judge Christopher Limbaugh ruled that lawmakers could redraw congressional lines in the middle of the decade, a decision that will be appealed to the Missouri Supreme Court. And U.S. District Judge Zachary Bluestone threw out a lawsuit from Attorney General Catherine Hanaway that sought to stop a referendum over a new congressional map aimed at ousting Democrat Emanuel Cleaver from his Kansas City-based seat. The day after Bluestone's decision, the advocacy group People Not Politicians submitted more than 305,000 signatures to place the map up for a statewide vote. That was a move that the group's executive director, Richard Von Glahn, said was a monumental show of direct democracy.
Missouri voters are going to be the final deciders on this issue. Our democracy belongs to us, not to politicians, and we're going to have the final say.
I would love to spend the next hour examining the minutiae around some of these developments, such as how Limbaugh utilized a line of argument eerily similar to a pivotal scene in the 1997 family comedy Air Bud to uphold the new map. But I'd rather focus on how Missouri Republicans reacted to the redistricting referendum. Since the signature gathering effort was launched in September, Secretary of State Denny Hoskins and Attorney General Catherine Hanaway have used legal and procedural maneuvers to block the referendum from going to voters. In addition to Hanaway's lawsuit, Hoskins is trying to prevent tens of thousands of signatures gathered before mid-October from counting. He contends that he needs to approve the referendum for circulation first.
Currently, we are keeping all the signatures that were gathered before October 14th separate from those that were gathered after October 14th. We'll keep them. Currently, we are not counting those signatures, but we are keeping them in case a court order happens or something happens that says that those signatures must be counted.
Hoskins startled a lot of redistricting observers when he said the new map would go into effect. Hanaway then declared yesterday that the districts from the map passed back in September are officially in place. People Not Politicians attorney Chuck Hatfield said that statement ran afoul of the Missouri Constitution and recent precedent, and this will likely spark yet another legal battle in a saga full of legal battles. But it was this comment that hit at a broader observation about this particular era of Missouri politics.
These politicians are in a full-blown tantrum trying to figure out anything they can do to stop this. So I'm not surprised that they've made up yet another incorrect reason to try to stop the will of the people on this. But they're wrong, and if they persist in that position, sounds like they're starting to harden into it now, we will end up in court again.
Hatfield's sentiments perhaps showcase the most obvious and controversial tension in Missouri politics right now, how a lot of Republicans are openly hostile to Missourians enacting policies, or in the case of the new congressional map, repealing policies through statewide votes. That's possible in Missouri thanks to its initiative petition and referendum process. After all, this year saw the General Assembly repealing voter-approved paid sick leave requirements and trying to strike down abortion rights protections Missourians ratified more than a year ago. Legislators are also trying to make it nearly impossible to pass any constitutional amendment that the General Assembly doesn't put up for a statewide vote, a plan that prominent GOP political figures like Lieutenant Governor David Wassinger support.
These East Coast and left coast billionaires have hijacked our Missouri Constitution, and to the extent they haven't, the dysfunction of the Missouri legislature has now, we've got marijuana, whether you're for or against it, in the Missouri Constitution. We have online gaming, which is a very fluid situation, now embedded in our Constitution. We have abortion now embedded in our Constitution. Had the Missouri legislature addressed initiative petition reform years ago, we wouldn't have these issues.
It is true that a lot of out-of-state money flows into Missouri ballot initiatives, including the referendum effort. It's also true that President Donald Trump does not live in Missouri. Recall that Trump exerted enormous pressure on the General Assembly to redraw the state's congressional lines. In fact, the president started the great 2025 nationwide redistricting frenzy by getting Texas to create 5 more GOP-leaning seats to prevent Democrats from taking over the U.S. House. And the referendum in Missouri presents a major threat to Trump's goal for Republicans to maintain the House, hence the all-out legal and procedural push to enact the new congressional lines here. At least one Missouri Republican I spoke with this week found it distasteful how his party is reacting to things like the redistricting referendum and other voter-approved ballot items.
And it's always been just wildly hypocritical to work in that environment where my colleagues say the voters are smart enough to vote for me, to send me to the Senate. But I'll tell you what they're not smart enough to do is figure out the nuance of this ballot initiative or that ballot initiative.
That's Lincoln Huff, who represents the city of Springfield in the Missouri Senate. Huff was one of 2 Republican senators who voted against the map, as well as a procedural maneuver known as the previous question to cut off debate on the proposal. Not a single change was made to the new congressional map, which Huff points out is a major shift from previous redistricting efforts.
It's a meat grinder of a session every time we have to go through redistricting. But you know what happens? People get together and people negotiate and people talk. And we've never in my tenure, right, of almost 14 years now, we've never just been handed a map and said, here it is, don't touch it, don't even talk about it, just pass it. Like, I think if you showed that map to a bunch of 4th graders, right, who are studying, Missouri politics and state government, I think they'd look at that and say, who in the world drew this?
Huff is nearing the end of his tenure in the Missouri General Assembly due to term limits. And he says the redistricting gambit is indicative of troubling trends with the Missouri Republican Party and the National Republican Party.
The folks in D.C., I think they're so hyper-focused on doing whatever the thing is that they want to do right now that almost, ramifications be damned. We're not worried about where this thing's going to go in the next 6 months, 8 months, year, whether it gets tossed out. I mean, my fear is, well, if a court says this map is unconstitutional, I mean, who's to say that, well, what we really need to do, Jason, is start replacing judges until we get the verdicts we want.
Republicans would counter Huff by saying that not everything that voters approve through a statewide initiative is good policy. For instance, Missourians approved campaign donation limits in 2016, and those guidelines did not stop large amounts of money from influencing Missouri elections, but it did make it much harder to track where it was going. Both Republicans and Democrats agree that voter-approved campaign finance system has been an utter failure. Denny Hoskins took a similar approach when asked how he would respond to critics who feel like he and other Republicans are trampling on popular sentiment by trying to derail the redistricting referendum.
As Secretary of State, my job is to administer the law, not make the law. That's the preview of the General Assembly as well as the governor. So if Missourians do not agree with Missouri state law, then they need to lobby their state representative, their state senator, as well as the governor to get the law changed. But my job as Secretary of State is to follow the law, and I believe that the law is very clear in the process that should take place with a referendum as well as congressional redistricting map.
Some Democrats I've talked to over the past year contend that Republicans are not going to change their hostility toward voter-approved measures unless they face political consequences. And that did not happen after they tried to torpedo a Medicaid expansion initiative in 2021, or when they engineered a reversal of a voter-approved state legislative redistricting system in 2020, or when they repealed a ballot item regulating dog breeding, or enacted conceal and carry over voter objections. Democratic State Senator Tracy McCreary of St. Louis County says voters need to be more proactive, especially since they've consistently backed the GOP having full control of Missouri's legislature and statewide offices.
Republicans have been in charge of the state of Missouri now for over 20 years. So things that I hear complaints about every day when I take calls from my constituents, those are not problems that the Democrats have created in the Missouri legislature. Those are problems that the Republican politicians need to own. So voters need to start paying attention and communicating to people and having conversations with people, because we're not going to be able to get the state out of the mess that it's in without the voters getting more engaged.
So as the fight over Missouri's congressional lines continues on, it's hard to say if the deluge of redistricting news this week will alter longer-term political trends throughout the state. But given the fact that redrawing the lines on Missouri's map sparked so many people to sign their names to a referendum that the state GOP is trying to stop, it doesn't seem like the discord between what Missouri Republicans want to do and what many of the state's voters support will cease anytime soon. We need to take a quick break, but when we return, we'll talk with State Representative LaKeySha Bosley about what's next in the state's redistricting fight and how it will affect the 2026 legislative session. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. So, as we established in the last segment, there's a fierce battle over Missouri's new congressional map, which seeks to transform Democrat Emanuel Cleaver's Kansas City-based district into a GOP-leaning seat. But a potential decision from the U.S. Supreme Court could provoke another redistricting fight over Missouri's first congressional district, which takes in all of St. Louis and part of St. Louis County. The conservative majority on the court is widely expected to strike down a part of the Voting Rights Act that protects minority-majority districts. And as U.S. Senator Eric Schmitt explained to me last week, the High Court's decision could have an impact on the first district, which has had a majority or plurality African-American population for decades.
I do think that the Supreme Court will say that as applied, that section has essentially been abused and furthered racial discrimination, meaning they're drawing congressional districts for the overwhelming purpose of gerrymandering by race, which is unconstitutional and not allowed in this country, and it shouldn't be allowed in this country. As to what they do with a future map, I'll leave that up to the legislature. I think that you'll see a number of those discussions, not just in Missouri, but across particularly the Mid-South and the Southeast and the South, as these districts have been protected by, I think, an interpretation of the law that's about to get thrown out.
If Republicans are able to go after the first district, it would mark a startling end to an unusual alliance between GOP lawmakers and Black Democrats in St. Louis, and it could have broader ramifications for Missouri congressional politics and African-American political power. Joining me to discuss the future of the first district is State Representative LaKeySha Bosley, a Democrat who represents the St. Louis-based 79th District. Representative, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
It's always great to be here. Thank you for having me, Jason.
Last month, Attorney General Catherine Hanaway's office defended the new congressional map that we've been talking about on this program by saying the map lawmakers approved in 2022 contains an unconstitutional racial gerrymander, the 1st Congressional District. And it would be an unconstitutional racial gerrymander if the U.S. Supreme Court throws out a map in Louisiana. What was your reaction when you saw that brief?
I told you so. It was my immediate reaction. We had this conversation in the legislature when we were doing this unconstitutional, which I believe is unconstitutional and absolutely morally wrong, of trying to do a midterm redistricting, about how this would affect the 1st Congressional District and how the 1st Congressional District under this map has changed.
And can you explain how it's changed, by the way?
So it has shifted south. So that is now encompassing right up where we would call District 1, which is Doug Beck's district, Afton area.
In South St. Louis County, yes.
In South St. Louis County. So it has shifted completely down to that area. And it's butting up against that, which is majority a white area. So we've picked up a lot more white voters if this map was to go into effect. It's unfortunate, though, that we got to have this conversation. I think that it is important to note that the senator definitely is correct when he says, where are these districts going to come from? And it's going to come from the South, which is the reason why we had the Voting Rights Act put into place to begin with. So no, it is not a unconstitutional thing to make sure that people of color have representation as they are referring to the U.S. Senate or the U.S. House of Representatives. We want representation to matter, and it's going to happen to the 1st Congressional.
So I asked Hanaway's office, how she came up with this conclusion, given that the 1st district under the new map, while it has changed, and we'll discuss that more, from a functional standpoint, would still probably elect an African American. And she said it was because there was no racial data that was used to put the proposal together, and therefore the new map was, quote, race blind. What do you think about that?
I believe we passed something that stated that it had to be balanced when it comes to race. So if it's race blind, then we are absolutely not doing our part in making sure that the Voting Rights Act applies.
Because,
to
by
this
the way,
map.
I should point this out. The Voting Rights Act Section 2 is still in effect until the Supreme Court decides.
Yeah.
And the reason that's important is, and I wasn't the person that pointed that out, Congressman Wesley Bell will point that out in this clip right here.
I think it's an insult to anyone with an ounce of common sense. The idea that in their kind and kindred spirit, the Missouri legislature is just looking to be, to anticipate a ruling by a court and therefore violating what the law of the land is now and what the courts have interpreted the Constitution now. I think it's just a straw man argument. Everyone knows it. And what got this going was President Trump made a call in to not only the governor of Texas, but also the governor of Missouri and said, give me another seat. That's where this started. And what I would say is we don't even have to focus on the racial component, which I think in this country we can't ignore, but also just the fact that voters in the Kansas City area have more in common with one another than they do with farmers 250 miles away on the Illinois-Iowa border.
That was Missouri Congressman Wesley Bell reacting to Attorney General Catherine Hanaway's legal brief, stating that a pending U.S. Supreme Court decision could imperil the 1st District. So I interrupted you mid-answer, but I did want to include the congressman making a point you were about to make. So continue.
I mean, it's all there. It's relevant. And it's so great to have like minds when we're talking about this. we don't want to focus on race, but it is a part of what is currently right now in our Constitution with the Voting Rights Act. And I think that it's imperative for us to look at the facts that our legislature, and I'm trying my best to find the words that are not as abrupt and as harsh as I would like to be, because people really need to understand what's at stake here. And the legislature is playing with people's lives, quite literally. And that means that they're playing with their access to their legislature and to their representatives.
So one of the reasons why Hanaway's brief surprised me is that Republicans have been the biggest supporters of the first district for decades because it makes the second and third districts much more Republican. In fact, white Democrats in St. Louis, not Republicans, have been the biggest antagonists of this district over the last 40 or 50 years. Just read any of Bill Clay's books, and he will talk about how Republicans were the most helpful people in creating the first district. That was probably your reaction, too, as somebody who may know a little about St. Louis politics based off your family lineage, right?
Yeah. I mean, listen, there has always been an alignment for African Americans and for people of color, especially in the city of St. Louis, when it comes to protecting certain rights for everyone. And I think that it's important to note that what the time that you're talking about is when they got rid of, I believe that was Russ Carnahan's seat. And it was a lot of contention around whether to keep the first congressional district, which was to keep Bill Clay's, or to keep Russ Carnahan. And ultimately, the conversation was, listen, we want to preserve African-American representation in Congress and in the city of St. Louis.
Yeah, the deciding votes on that were from African-American, 2 African-American Democrats from St. Louis and 2 from Kansas City to break Governor Nixon's veto. So that's an example of this alliance working. And one of the things that I think hasn't been talked a lot about for this new map, this is probably the first time maybe in like 60, 70 years, that there was not one African-American Democrat who voted for this map.
Or supported it. Nope.
Can you talk about like what that means and what this means that this alliance I talked about may no longer be in play for future redistricting cycles?
So let's think about the history of African-American voting, right? Most people don't realize that African Americans and Black people were originally Republicans before they were Democrats. And the shift happened during the Civil Rights Movement because the Republican Party at that time would not get our leaders, civil rights leaders, out of jail. They were like, no, we don't want to touch that. So Black people said, we'll show you better than we can tell you. And we moved to the Democratic, what is now considered the Democratic Party, which is why we have such a stronghold within this party, because we built it from what it is, from where it was to what it is now. And I think that it's important for us to note, too, that because African American people find a way, we've always been able to find a way to survive. We've been in survival mode for over 400 years when we were brought to this country, and some who are currently still here. And I think it's important to also mention that most African American people come from conservative backgrounds, are more so conservative when it comes to just anything you can think of, abortion rights, or it is ultimately because of the fact that for so many years we did not have the capacity to have access or control over our own rights. So we are not dictating or wanting to dictate someone else's. So the fact that you had elected leaders who were no longer supporting or in support because there was no benefit for anybody within this new congressional map.
I want to go to this new congressional map. Do you think the first district still has a plurality Black population under this new proposal, especially since the May 16th tornado may have displaced thousands of African Americans in North St. Louis?
Absolutely not. I think when we're seeing the shift of where African Americans are moving in this region, they're moving more north. They're going toward, I want to say northwest. So they're going toward the St. Charleses. They're going towards the Chesterfields. They're going towards the St. Peters. So the way that this map is drawn, it went down south and it did not go up north. Why would you take Champ out of the 1st Congressional District when there was a population of, 1 or 2 people there?
Not many. And I will just say that it is still probably permissible under the Voting Rights Act to drop a plurality African American district, but where African Americans wouldn't be the plurality, as long as it's still high enough to where an African American would get elected, because not every white voter is going to vote against the black candidate.
That is true.
So I still think a black candidate would win under the new district, unless it's a very divided field, which happened in Memphis with Steve Cohen. But continue.
I mean, there could be possible. You are right. It could happen, but the facts are the facts. When you have a voting population in the city where we don't even have a high turnout of 15%. I don't think we've even broken 30% in the last several.
It depends on the election.
Cycles.
I think that you broke 30% during the presidential election, but if you're talking about municipal elections, the turnout hasn't been great at certain times.
It has not. And then when we're talking about mid-districting, if we look at midterm elections too in the city, you will also notice that the voter turnout is not very high as well. But I think that plays in our favor this go around. I think what they're going to do is shoot themselves in the foot, because you have so much national attention around the GOP starving people, making sure that people do not have access to health care, which was the biggest fight that we've had since the Affordable Care Act came into play. I think these are some of the very pivotal things right now that will actually turn not only the Congressional District, the 1st Congressional District, on its head, but it could potentially put us in an uncomfortable position going forward.
Okay, so I want to play a clip from the September special session. It's of you, by the way.
Me?
Yes.
I love to hear myself.
Yes, during a committee hearing about the new map. I don't remember what committee it was, but in the House,
elections.
It gets passed from a committee, and then it goes into a rules committee.
Yep.
And this was one of the rules committee. Here is State Representative LaKeySha Bosley in September.
Let's call these maps what they are. They are racist. Period. Full stop. And every one of you are going to probably sit there and pat yourselves on the back. Oh, she's crazy. Oh, she's fear-mongering. Oh, this is race baiting. No, you are the ones causing the race baiting. You're the ones getting people amped up and ready to go. You're the reason why people are protesting in the streets. Because you're not listening to them, and every chance you get, you want to step on the minority.
How did your colleagues react to you after you said that?
Well, they probably still feel the same way that I mean, listen, you got to call a spade when it is what it is. And of course, nobody likes the R word, or they don't like the term racist. And because racists don't like to actually know that they're racist. They don't want anyone to pull up the mirror to them to show them exactly who they are. So my colleagues on the other side of the aisle probably dismissed it. They probably was like, oh, here we go again, another black person calling us racist. And in their hearts of hearts, some of them may feel like this is not what it is.
I was going to say, because I did talk with State Representative Richard West after that hearing, and he said, we're trying to maximize Republican gains. There's not a racial intent here. And I'm sure that maybe some Republicans said the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, listen, unintended consequences, it's the same as if you accidentally hit somebody with a ball, right? And you say, oh, I'm sorry. It still doesn't take the pain away that you hit them with the ball. You're still hitting people. And what you're doing right now, you may not intentionally meant to be racist, but the map within itself, the way that it is drawn, the way that it is dividing minorities, not only in the 5th Congressional District, but also in the 1st Congressional District. It is dividing people of color up and putting them in sectors and in areas, regardless of whether it's GOP or not, in places that they have no commonality. It is intentionally dividing people from their neighbors.
I mean, especially if in Kansas City, where the dividing line was Troost, which is basically the Kansas City equivalent of Del Mar.
Yes.
So I want to point that out to give our listeners context, because frankly, I don't know the geography of Kansas City as well as St. Louis.
And also, I don't think that, unfortunately, my colleagues don't know the geography either, because this wasn't even their map to begin with. Nobody could give you data or information about how this map was drawn in the first place.
So we've talked a lot on this show about the various scenarios about where Missouri's congressional map will shake out. But I want to ask you, how do you think this battle is going to affect your last year in the Missouri House?
I'll be honest, what happened in the Senate was absolutely deplorable. PQ after PQ after the PQ. And that's the previous question. You can pretty much say that the Senate turned into the House. I think there are a lot of senators who are very still upset about that, at lie after lie after lie after lie. I don't know if we're going to have a functioning Senate this go around.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I sat through the hearing that Representative West did on the map, and I came away being like, he let everybody talk up from the crowd. He gave them extra time. He waited until everybody was done. I was like, this could have gone a lot worse. Mm-hmm. And there was actually an attempt to let people speak. The outcome was predetermined.
Yeah. Not
so much in the Senate, because they cut out debate pretty quickly, and the committee hearings, I think, were pretty short by consideration.
Yes, they were.
If there is gridlock from the backlash from redistricting, how is that going to affect really critical things? Like, there could be a need for the legislature to provide more money for the tornado. Mm-hmm. Is that not going to be able to happen because there's not a functional Senate?
I think we had a lot of favor with our approach chairs on both sides in the House and in the Senate. And I think that we can still get tornado relief dollars, but that may look very different because now you have the House, which will be in control, where typically we would have at least someone on the other side of the chamber that would give some recourse to allow us to go to a committee, to have a conference committee on these decision items. But now when you have people who are complete lock and step, there is no room for error.
Though I mentioned this will be your last year in the Missouri House. You started in 2019, which was a very different world from 2025. Do you think, what do you kind of think the Missouri legislature is compared to when you entered?
Civility is no longer a part of the conversation. This is a all-out knuckle fight. And I mean that in terms of when you have people who have so much power, they don't feel like that they need to talk to anybody else who may have an opposing view. And I think right now we are in a space where you have a polarizing, demanding, and yet tyrannical president who will call, threaten, do any and everything. We saw it happen in Indiana. We're seeing it happening in Missouri, where you had even our governor was like, how could you say no to this guy? When they put him on speakerphone in a call in a closeted room to have this conversation about redistricting. I think we are in very dangerous times when you will not allow the opposing voice to have its say, cutting off debate and also cutting off committee hearings and not even wanting to listen to the people to begin with.
State Representative LaKeySha Bosley is a St. Louis Democrat who has represented Missouri's 79th House District for the last 7 years. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
When we return, we'll talk about what to expect in Illinois' 2026 election cycle. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Throughout his more than 40 years of congressional service, U.S. Senator Dick Durbin saw Illinois morph from a state that both major political parties fiercely contested to one of the safest Democratic strongholds in the nation. Perhaps the biggest evidence of this political metamorphosis is how lots and lots and lots of prominent Democrats are now vying to succeed Durbin after he announced he would not run again in 2026. And while there may not be as much general election suspense in Illinois as there was when Durbin first won his Senate seat, that doesn't mean the results won't be important for the state's political future and perhaps the 2028 presidential contest. Here to preview the land of Lincoln's 2026 election season is Brenden Moore, a State House reporter for Capital News Illinois. Brenden, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Good to be with you, Jason.
After Durbin announced his retirement, how would you characterize the reaction among Democrats in Illinois?
I would say it was expected. It was kind of Durbin had waited a while. Several other prominent U.S. senators had announced their retirements before, and a lot of people were like, okay, Senator, we want to give you your space, but we also want to get our campaign started. Senator Durbin turned 80 this year. He was not expected to run for re-election, so it was very much kind of a expected retirement announcement, and a lot of candidates, as you mentioned, Jason, were ready to go to run for that seat when he announced in April.
Do you think he would have faced a serious primary challenge had he decided not to step aside? Like, he's not considered a conservative Democrat at all. I mean, I think he kind of was in the beginning of his tenure, but I could see a lot of anxious Democrats in Illinois being like, I want my turn. You've had your turn for 40 years. Like, would he have cleared the field had he run again?
I think he would have had some kind of challenge, but I don't think it would have been a serious challenge. Obviously, there's a lot of angst in the Democratic primary base right now among the grassroots wanting generational change. And obviously, there's a debate about how to contest President Trump and Republicans in Washington. Durbin took a pretty unpopular vote here with Democrats back in March when he voted to for a continuing resolution to fund the government, basically joined a handful of other Democrats, but was not popular with the base. A lot of people expected when he did that, like, okay, he's probably retiring, but he's an institutionalist, liberal but an institutionalist. He probably would have had maybe a progressive and up-and-comer, ambitious person try to run. But as you know, it's very hard to run statewide in Illinois. It costs a lot of money to get on television, especially in Chicago. He probably would have cleared the field of serious contenders. Like, you would not have had a Raja Krishnamurthy running or a Juliana Stratton running. But, you know, you would have had like a state rep or a state senator maybe give it a shot. But everyone kind of expected if Durbin did run, he would have won. But obviously, he opted to retire.
So can you give us a sense of how many people have filed to run for Durbin's Senate seat? And among the candidates, who are the most serious contenders to win the March 17th primary?
I believe the number is 17. I'll have to double check that. But a lot of candidates filed, but they're still kind of parsing out the ballot. There's several candidates that are expected to not to be knocked off for not having enough signatures or other disqualifying merits. But really in the Democratic primary, there's a focus on three candidates. So there's Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. There's Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton and Congresswoman Robin Kelly, who represents a district that goes from Chicago South Side to Danville. So Krishnamurthy's really kind of staked out the front runner status in this race. He's easily raised the most money. He's been on television since July, is spending $500,000 a week. He has the most name recognition. And it's really going to be interesting to see if Stratton or Kelly are able to put up more of a fight. I think a lot of people expected this to be more contentious, and it's kind of been sleepy so far.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned that the Democratic primary may just be the election here, primarily because the suburbs of Chicago have gone from being contested battlegrounds to these impenetrable Democratic strongholds. So how important is it going to be for Democratic candidates in this primary to win there? And do the two Chicago candidates, Stratton and Kelly, kind of have a disadvantage, even though I guess Kelly does represent some suburbs, but not the ones that may vote the most?
Yeah, I think that's been the big change in Illinois politics over the past decade or two is the suburbs, which used to be the bedrock of the Republican Party, have really shifted from not even purple. I mean, they're blue now. They are pretty safely Democratic, and they are what will help decide this election. And Krishnamurthy represents a lot of these suburbs in suburban Cook County, Kane County, parts of DuPage, where Democrats have really gained a big foothold over the past decade. So he may have an advantage in some of those areas, although we should not discount that the base of the Democratic Party, the most loyal supporters of the Democratic Party, are still black voters on the south and west sides of Chicago and in the south suburbs, which Robin Kelly does represent. So I think that they still have advantages with those groups. I mean, Stratton and Kelly are both black women, but I do think too, though, that there is a concern about whether they may splinter that vote and allow Krishnamurthy to win if he does maybe coalesce more support in the Chicago suburbs. It should also be noted that he has traveled the most of any of the candidates downstate. He, again, has a lot of money to spend on ads down here. So, while downstate may not be as significant of a cog in the Democratic base in Illinois, it could, help cushion in a contested primary, especially when you have several candidates that are splitting the vote.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question, because probably the only area of Illinois where Republicans have gained ground is Southern Illinois, including parts of the Metro East. You kind of mentioned this already. Is that going to be like a major battleground, or is this just going to be kind of an afterthought, and the candidates are mainly going to be focusing on getting out the vote in the Chicago suburbs or in Chicago proper?
I think that they're going to battle for votes downstate. I mean, they're going to battle everywhere for votes because every vote counts in this state. And again, I think that it can be a decisive factor in a primary, where especially if you're splitting up votes in the Chicago area. It's a couple decades ago now, but the reason we had a governor, Rod Blagojevich, is because he did really well in downstate Illinois. Paul Vallis, who later ran for mayor, did really well in the suburbs, but didn't had a fear of flying, didn't want to get on a plane to go downstate and campaign, and that hurt him. Even J.B. Pritzker did really well downstate in the Democratic primary in 2018. So it's probably a pretty small number when you look at the raw vote in a Democratic primary. It's still, Cook County and the collar counties are still going to be kind of where this thing is probably decided. But again, if this does get to be a close race, those votes not even in the rural counties, but like you do have some pockets of, medium-sized cities in downstate Illinois, such as Bloomington Normal, Champaign-Urbana, obviously in the Metro East, where you have, pretty strong Democratic support. And, that can make a difference. And again, I think, Congressman Krishnamurthy has probably been the most visible down here, has really played up his downstate roots. He's from Peoria. He was raised there, and has tried to tie himself to Senator Durbin, kind of saying, I'm going to be kind of in the mold of Senator Durbin, representing the whole state, and trying to ingratiate himself with downstate Democrats.
We're talking with Brenden Moore, a State House reporter for Capital News Illinois, about the 2026 election in the land of Lincoln. So I'm going to ask you a really blunt question. Is there any reason we should pay attention to the Republican primary for the U.S. Senate, since the GOP chances of succeeding Durbin are basically zero?
No. If we're being honest, the Democrat, whoever wins the Democratic primary, is going to be very heavily favored to win the general election in November. I think there are 6 or 7 candidates total that filed on the Republican side, but there's only one real serious candidate, and that's Don Tracy, who is an attorney in Springfield. He's the former state Republican Party chairman. His family owns Dot Foods based out of Mount Sterling, so he has some family money, independently wealthy. He'll probably be the nominee, but I especially in a midterm year where Republicans control the White House and a blue state like Illinois, it's very, very hard to see a Republican having much electoral success on a statewide election.
Yeah, and that was actually going to transition into Governor J.B. Pritzker's decision to run for a third term as governor. Again, I'm not trying to predict elections. I typically don't do that. But given that he won by a really large margin in 2022, which was not a great year for Democrats, my question isn't if he's going to win re-election. Is he going to become the first Democrat in my lifetime to break 60% of the vote? That's actually what I'm interested in, because that's one of the weird quirks about Illinois politics. Illinois had Republican governors pretty consistently in the 1980s and 1990s who won sometimes by over 60% of the vote. And Democrats have only gotten 55, 56. Is next year the year J.B. Pritzker may actually break the 60% mark?
I don't think so. And I say that because while Illinois is a safely Democratic state, and the northeast part of the state, the Chicago suburbs, where most of the votes are, safely Democratic. As you mentioned earlier, downstate Illinois has gotten a lot more Republican. And so that has helped, I guess, kind of stave off, the state from going, in a direction where it is Democratic in a way like, Vermont would be.
Although Vermont has a Republican governor, but continue.
It's true. That is true. That's a good point. But he won with 54% the first time, 55% the second time. And that's kind of a generic Democratic performance in a statewide election in Illinois. Usually it's about 54, 55% for the Democrat, about 42, 43% for the Republican. I would expect a pretty similar spread because J.B. Pritzker is very popular with Democrats. He will get his people out. There are more Democrats in this state than Republicans. But at the same time, he's not very popular with Republicans, and he's kind of got middling approval ratings with independent voters. So even for being, again, a Democratic state, I wouldn't say he's the most popular guy, with voters overall. But then again, I think then the question is, with any, incumbent running for reelection, it's kind of, what's the alternative? And I think a lot of people look at some of the options on the Republican side for governor, and especially in the Chicago suburbs, say, that's not somebody that I can vote for.
No, the most popular Democrat who's ran for statewide was Jesse White because of the Jesse White tumblers. And and no one will ever beat the Jesse White tumblers. But we can talk more about that another time. Brenden Moore is a State House reporter for Capital News Illinois, and he has been covering all things Land of Lincoln for many years. And we thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, anytime.
The Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air is produced by Jason Rosenbaum, Alex Hoyer, Emily Woodbury, Danny Wissentowski, Maya Norfleet, and Elaine Cha. Audio engineering and sound design by Aaron Dorr. The politics editor is Fred Ehrlich.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.